It's not every day that New York City rewrites history, but on November 4th, 2025, a 34-year-old assemblyman from Queens did exactly that. Zohran Mamdani, a name many New Yorkers barely knew just a year ago, pulled off one of the biggest political upsets in decades, defeating former Governor Andrew Cuomo to become the city's first Muslim mayor. In a race that was supposed to be a comeback story for a political giant, it turned into a revolution led by the son of immigrants, a man born in Uganda, raised in New York, and fueled by a dream to make the city affordable again. This wasn't just an election, it was a rebellion against the powerful, the predictable, and the way politics has always been done in America's biggest city. But who is Zohran Mamdani, really? And how did a democratic socialist with barely 1% in early polls manage to conquer the most powerful political machines in the country? Before the headlines, before the cheering crowds, and long before City Hall, there was just Zohran, a kid who understood what struggle looked like. Born in Uganda to Indian parents who fled political unrest, Zohran Mamdani's story begins far from the glittering skyline of Manhattan. His mother, a filmmaker, his father, a professor. Together they built a new life in New York, a city that would one day make their son its leader. But Zohran's path wasn't one of privilege or power. While others were born into politics, he was raised among working-class New Yorkers, families juggling rent, bills, and dreams that often felt too far away. Those early years shaped his fire. He studied at Bowdoin College, explored the arts as a rapper and community organizer, and later worked as a housing counselor, helping tenants fight unfair evictions. That experience, seeing families lose their homes while the rich got richer, planted the seed of something bigger. By 2020, that seed had become a movement. Mamdani ran for New York State Assembly and won, defeating a longtime incumbent backed by the political establishment. It was the first sign that this young activist from Queens wasn't afraid to challenge power and win. His message was simple but resonant. Politics should belong to the people who live the struggle, not the ones who profit from it. And as the city's crisis deepened, rent skyrocketing, inequality widening, that message would soon become the rallying cry of a much bigger revolution. When Zohran Mamdani stepped into the mayoral race, few took him seriously. He wasn't a billionaire, a celebrity, or a career politician. He was a 34-year-old assemblyman with a vision that many called too radical for America's biggest city. But to millions of struggling New Yorkers, his message hit home. While his opponents talked about crime stats and Wall Street, Mamdani talked about rent, groceries, and survival. His campaign wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built on subway platforms, in community centers, and on the streets of Queens. He called his movement, "A City We Can Afford." A slogan that wasn't just catchy, it was revolutionary. His plan? To tackle New York's affordability crisis head-on. Free public buses, universal childcare, city-run grocery stores, and rent freezes for working families. He promised to raise taxes on the ultra-wealthy and corporations to fund it all, saying, "The people who built this city shouldn't have to beg to stay in it." It wasn't just policy. It was poetry for those who'd been priced out, ignored, and left behind. And while critics called his ideas unrealistic, supporters saw something they hadn't seen in years: hope. Young voters, first-time voters, and disillusioned Democrats started to believe that maybe, just maybe, New York could work for the many again. Social media amplified his message like wildfire. Campaign clips of Mamdani rapping in community events, speaking in Arabic and Spanish, and cracking jokes about rent prices went viral. Suddenly, the underdog from Queens wasn't just running for mayor. He was becoming a cultural movement. And as that movement grew, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be an ordinary election, because standing in his way was a political heavyweight who'd ruled New York for over a decade. It was the showdown no one expected, and the one every New Yorker couldn't stop watching. On one side, Andrew Cuomo, the seasoned political giant. A former governor, a man who once ruled Albany with an iron fist, now plotting a comeback to reclaim the city he believed was still his. On the other, Zohran Mamdani, the 34-year-old underdog who dared to challenge the empire. In February 2025, Mamdani was polling at just 1%, dead last in a crowded field. Cuomo, backed by party elites and big donors, was considered untouchable. The media barely mentioned Mamdani's name, but in the neighborhoods, his movement was catching fire. Grassroots volunteers flooded subway stations, housing complexes, and bodegas. They spoke in dozens of languages, handing out flyers and hope in equal measure. For many New Yorkers, Mamdani wasn't just another candidate, he was one of them. Cuomo's campaign leaned on old-school muscle, endorsements, money, and nostalgia. But the more he tried to flex his past, the more voters remembered why he'd fallen. The scandals, the arrogance, the resignation that ended his career in disgrace. By June, the unthinkable happened. Against every prediction, Mamdani surged ahead, fueled by working-class voters and a wave of progressives tired of politics as usual. When the final primary results dropped, it wasn't even close. Mamdani crushed Cuomo by 13 points. New York hadn't just chosen a new candidate. It had chosen a new era. The establishment was stunned. The media called it the biggest Democratic upset since AOC. Cuomo's allies scrambled. But the battle wasn't over yet. Not even close. Because New York, unlike most states, doesn't have a sore loser law. That meant Cuomo could still run, this time as an independent. And he did, under his self-made banner, the Fight and Deliver Party. It was the rematch no one saw coming, and the city braced for one of the most brutal general elections in decades. By the time November rolled around, New York City had turned into a political battlefield. The establishment was shaken, the headlines were explosive, and the city's future hung in the balance. Andrew Cuomo refused to fade quietly. After losing the Democratic primary, he created his own third party, the Fight and Deliver Party, and charged back into the race, determined to prove that the city still belonged to him. His campaign was slick, relentless, and fueled by old allies from his gubernatorial days. But Mamdani's team wasn't intimidated. They doubled down on what had gotten them there: people power. Door-to-door volunteers, multilingual flyers, and viral street rallies turned neighborhoods into campaign zones. From Harlem to Jackson Heights, his message echoed the same promise: a city we can afford. And while Cuomo spent his time attacking Mamdani's political ideology and faith, Mamdani stayed focused on what mattered: rent, wages, and the cost of living. He turned the election into a conversation about survival. And in a city tired of scandals and corruption, that message hit harder than any ad campaign ever could. Meanwhile, former Mayor Eric Adams' collapse had left a leadership vacuum. His corruption scandal and historic disapproval ratings only fueled the public's hunger for something new. Mamdani became the embodiment of that hunger, a fresh face in a city desperate for change. Then came election night. The polls had barely closed when the unthinkable became reality. Within 30 minutes, the Associated Press called it: Zohran Mamdani had defeated Andrew Cuomo and Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa in a landslide victory. He wasn't just New York's next mayor. He was the city's first Muslim mayor, its first South Asian leader, and one of the youngest in modern history. The images flooded social media. Queens erupting in cheers, supporters waving banners that read, "From the people, for the people." Mamdani stood on stage beside Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, telling the crowd, "Let us win a city hall that works for those straining to buy groceries, not those straining to buy our democracy." And as fireworks lit up the skyline, one thing was clear: New York had spoken, loudly. No sooner had the confetti settled than the storm began. Zohran Mamdani's victory was historic, but it also exposed the deep divides simmering beneath New York City's surface. As the first Muslim mayor in the city's history, his faith, heritage, and politics were immediately thrust into the spotlight. Throughout the campaign, Mamdani had faced a steady drumbeat of skepticism and slander. Anonymous smear campaigns questioned his loyalty. Online trolls twisted his advocacy for Palestinian human rights into accusations of extremism. And when the Israel-Gaza conflict reignited global tensions, Mamdani's nuanced stance, condemning violence on all sides while calling for peace, was distorted by opponents desperate to turn faith into fear. But rather than retreat, he confronted it head-on. He spoke at interfaith events, prayed alongside rabbis, and joined Jewish leaders at vigils commemorating the October 7th attacks. One moment in particular stood out: when Jewish City Comptroller Brad Lander, once a political rival, joined Mamdani on stage to declare, "This city needs compassion more than division." Mamdani's campaign had already gone beyond typical politics. He released materials in Arabic, Spanish, Bengali, and even Yiddish, making his message of unity multilingual and deeply personal. To communities that had long felt unseen, it wasn't just smart strategy, it was respect. Still, not everyone was convinced. Real estate moguls and corporate donors whispered warnings that his socialist agenda would cripple the economy. Moderates in his own party fretted that his tax